Welcome to the Ashby Village Science and Ideas Group. My name is Joe Ebinger, and I coordinate this group's events with the help of our co-host and tech expert, Hillary Naylor. All of our members here have varied educational and work experience backgrounds, but we all share a common interest in science and new ideas. We currently have over 60 members in our group and another 100 on our guest list. We meet via Zoom on the second Thursday of every month from about 3 o'clock until 4:30. We have a different guest speaker each month who talks on a topic related to science and ideas. We rely on our science group members, all Ashby group members, our invitees, presenters, and others for ideas about new speakers and ways to connect with them. Special thanks this time to Suyan Bickner and Joan Stramanis for helping and recommending today's speaker. Besides our presentation today, I am actively recruiting speakers who might present to us in the coming year. That is next year. Coming later this year, here are some of the presentation topics and speakers. Next month, August 10th, Martha Jones, Associate Professor, Department of Medicine, Health and Society at Vanderbilt, will speak to us about economic demography, population aging, and the economy. In October, Alicia Welsh, I believe, will speak on a presentation entitled Conservation of Vultures of the World. On November 9th, there will be a presentation by Richard Schwartz, whose research has been focused on understanding the mechanism by which human cell growth is both enabled and contained in our bodies. On December 14th, Irene Kuhn will return to us to give a new talk on the progress in the field of cancer vaccine development. We are also looking for new speakers, always looking for new speakers. If you know someone, please recommend them to me along with their contact information. We invite all Ashby members to join our group. Others interested in Ashby Village or the presentations are always welcome. Please recall that Ashby Village is a 501c3 tax-exempt organization. Hillary, I ask that you place a link to the Ashby Village website in the chat. You can learn more about Ashby Village. And note to our guests, please consider making a donation or even joining the organization via our website. Let's move on to today. Everybody's talking about the weather. What's going on? Well, today, San Francisco water history researcher Joel Pomerantz will help us understand atmospheric rivers and how they've affected California and the West Coast. We may recognize that term, atmospheric rivers, from the news. Now we will meet them more intimately and learn their roles in regional history. Joel leads exploration walks in San Francisco and makes maps based upon 20 years of natural history research. He works with museums, schools, city staff, and others to create respect for the natural hydrology systems that still govern our lives, especially last year and this year. As the only researcher making a comprehensive analysis of San Francisco water, he has published multiple editions of maps, articles, and other resources. Joel created the SEEP City Map of San Francisco Water History, a complex map-based network, which he recently began printing on shower curtains. With all that, let me please welcome Joel Pomerantz. Joel.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Hillary. And thank you everybody else who is attending. It's nice to see a crowd. I wanted to begin before I share any images. I wanted to begin with a little bit more info about what I've been working on. But even before that, I'll just give you a quick general idea of what this talk will include. I'm going to not only talk about specifics of atmospheric rivers and climate history, but I'll also give you a little intro to the concepts of how the climate works around California and in the Bay Area. That'll give you a little bit of the terminology you need and a little bit of the sense of how it fits together as local, regional, and global. I don't really have anything larger than global for climate, but I'm sure there are climates on other planets. So we'll do that in another talk. So the way that I'm going to cover this is pretty focused and relatively brief. So there'll be lots of time at the end for Q&A. However, if you have clarification questions or don't understand something, I'm hoping that Hillary or whoever's monitoring the chat can interrupt me and let me know that someone needs a clarification, and we'll deal with the other Q&A at the end. I want to share with you first my this is my website, and you should all be able to see that now. This is the exploration walks that Joe mentioned, and something that's really key to understanding how to get on one of these think walks is take it seriously where I say that you should get in touch with me on this website, and in general, it talks about think walks, but there are none on the calendar. However, the truth is there are a lot on the calendar, but they're just full. What I do is I send a note to my email list before I put them on the public calendar, and they usually fill up before I do. So if you want to get notes about think walks that are coming up, you should go to this section of the website where you can add yourself to the mailing list. All right, now, just to let you know my latest project, I think Joe just mentioned it in passing. This is the sign shop that prints large-scale fabric that gives me access to these printers, very specialized printers where I print my maps on 6 foot by 6 foot pieces of cloth that are actually already made into shower curtains before I print onto them. So that's some, I actually have a couple of images here of people having already put up shower curtains with the Seep City map. And you can see that there are a bunch of different versions, different colors. Some of them have labels, some of them don't. And I've just been experimenting because I make each one individually. And it's been an amazing project, from the research through to the cartography and the artwork, and then learning how to use the equipment to print them on shower curtains. All of it's been really fun. I'm also planning to do, eventually, I don't know exactly when, I'm going to take this image and I'm going to, which is from a campaign that the Lake Merritt was used as an educational material at Lake Merritt. I'm going to eventually make some posters and shower curtains of this too. So that this one shows Lake Merritt, and it shows the channel, some of which was artificially created between Oakland and Alameda. The channel didn't used to go all the way through. Alameda didn't used to be an island. And Lake Merritt used to have a much bigger, all this brown area was a bigger connection to Lake Merritt from the bay. So that's pretty constricted now, but that's an important hydrological historical fact. And then there are all the different feeders that go into Lake Merritt shown on this map. Okay, so this is my Seep City website, seepcity.org, and you can order a map either on poster or a curtain. And now off the races. Okay, this is a photo taken by Michael Garcia, who I believe is present in the room. This is, I think you might recognize, the Golden Gate Bridge on the right. And you can see the fog layer down in here, looking kind of soupy, and San Francisco in the background. This is a nice early morning shot. And one of the key details of how the local climate system works, of course, is our summertime fog. So I want to tell you a little about how that happens. I'm not going to be able to fully explain how all the bubbles happen, but you can use your imagination for that part. Okay, so one element of the fog is we have the Central Valley, this section of California that is very large, bigger than a lot of eastern seaboard states. And it's surrounded by mountains, very significant mountain ranges. And then if you look closely, here at San Francisco is the only place where there's a break in the mountains where air can come into the Central Valley to replace the air that rises when it gets hot in the Central Valley. So it's the old principle, hot air rises. It draws in air from the one place where there's a low pass in the mountains. And occasionally it also gets foggy over these other slightly higher than sea level, but lowish places as well. But most of it comes in here through the bay. And it comes in not just because of that action, but because the fog itself is being created by what is essentially a refrigerator coil along the shore. So the moist, humid air from the ocean passes over as it's being drawn into the bay. This is Bay Area here, and it passes over this. The purple and dark blue is what's called the upwelling, which is cool water, actually very cold water by ocean standards, being pulled up from the depths right along the shore. And that acts as a refrigerator coil, turning the humid air into little droplets like clouds, sometimes at ground level, sometimes a little bit higher, even 1,000 feet up occasionally. But it's basically a fast moving shelf of cloud or fog, as we call it. And it is flowing like a river through the Golden Gate and into the Central Valley via the Sacramento River Delta. But what are these dwellings and how do they come about? Well, this is where your toilet knowledge comes in. So I'm sure you've had a conversation or two at some point about how toilets swirl this way or that way, depending on what hemisphere. Well, and of course it isn't even true, but it's an interesting discussion because most of the forces that determine rotational flows on the surface of the Earth are strong enough to affect winds and major bodies of water, but they're not strong enough to overcome the flushing action of your toilet. So really, I know this is going to be the most important, useful detail from your whole hour here. You're going to have a good takeaway. Next time you look at your toilet swirling, you'll get to evaluate whether your toilet is overcoming the Coriolis effect by the way that the toilet is designed, and most of them do. They flush in different directions. The Coriolis effect is the name of this, and it's in the northern hemisphere. It means that as you're looking down at the surface of the Earth, any flowing motion in a fluid, meaning air or liquid, gases or liquid, will veer to the right as it moves. Same with the southern hemisphere, but the other direction, it will veer to the left, and it means it ends up being a counterclockwise motion. That's the Coriolis effect. And it's the same concept as if you roll a nickel across a rotating disc, it won't go in a straight line. It'll curve because of the rotation, and this fluid, the air especially, because it's much less encumbered by friction, it does the same thing because of the rotation of the Earth. Okay, now the upwelling is directly from that. So the wind goes along the coast, down the coast. You see here it is going down the coast of California. And as it goes down the coast, it pushes water away from the coast. That's called Ekman transport. And it's a phenomenon that comes directly, even though this image doesn't show the wind line curving, it comes directly from the fact that the wind does, at both the microscopic and the macroscopic level, it does curve to the right as it moves along the coast and pushes the surface water out. Not a whole lot of the surface, just in some places 10 or 15 meters of the surface depth, and some places even dozens or 100 meters down, but it doesn't go all the way to the bottom, and therefore the surface layer as a whole is moving away from the shore. The same thing, oh, and the upwelling is because same concept about the Central Valley with the air. Here, the water is moving aside and needs to be replaced from somewhere. So it's being replaced from the cool water down below. That's the upwelling. It does the same thing when the wind moves along a shore in the other direction, which doesn't happen here very much. It's a downwelling because it pushes the surface water to the shore. So it's nice and symmetrical, and it's called Ekman pumping when it pushes it down into the water. But the thing is, we just talk about it around here as the upwelling. And it's a key element of our weather patterns around here and our overall climate systems. It's also a vulnerable element of our climate system because there have been times when the upwelling has slowed down recently, and there are all kinds of possibilities about how that could change based on wind patterns changing, and they are. Here's an overall look at the coast. The blue lines are the surface. The red line is under the surface, although in the wintertime, there's often a current that goes north along the coast at the surface. And then here at Point Conception, or Concepcion, as it was probably originally named by the Spanish, that's where there's the Southern California bight, meaning this indentation in the coast, and it forms an eddy, which is why surfing is so much better there than it is up here. You need a wetsuit up here near the bay, and there's the Bay Area. And here in the Southern California bight, next to the Channel Islands, it's much warmer water because the water cycles around along the coast from the south first. So if you're going surfing there, you don't need to have your wetsuit necessarily. Okay, now let's take a look at the broader upwelling. This is a different way of measuring the upwelling than the previous image. The image with the purple that I showed you first, that was a temperature-based graphic about the upwelling, and this one is actually based on the living material in the water. So cooler water coming up from the deep has a lot of really good nutrients in it. Nutrients that are based on the idea that dying things fall to the bottom of the ocean, and those nutrients aren't exposed to sunlight, and so there's very little that eats up those nutrients when they're down there. But when the upwelling pushes them to the surface, you get this, and this is chlorophyll measurements showing that the upwelling here, this is the San Francisco Bay Area, not very high resolution, but anyway, this is one of the upwelling areas. Point Reyes is here, and this is the whole area around the opening of our bay. This is Monterey Bay area, and these other spots along the coast, this one up in Washington on the border with Oregon, and these along the Northern California coast and part of Oregon. So it varies quite a lot depending on the shoreline shape, but the upwelling is a major factor here. Now back to the mountains. One of the things the mountains do that the mountains do this really dramatic thing with moist air. They don't just funnel it into the Central Valley. They also turn it into rain as it goes over the mountains. So the fact that the coast has a significant range and then the Sierra are even higher means that inland is an incredible amount of desert. It's the rain shadow, meaning the shadow of these mountain ranges, preventing water from getting inland by squeezing not literally squeezing, but by changing the temperature of the water so that it precipitates. And it comes out. I hope that that's not coming through the microphone. They're fixing the sewer out front and the whole place is vibrating. It's a water theme, you know. So the Sierra here and a bunch of mountain ranges in Nevada sequentially cause the moisture in the air to be wrung out by cooling as the air rises, and it gets more and more desert as it goes inland. Here are all the rivers pouring into the Central Valley, and they pour out through San Francisco Bay. This is a wonderful image that was actually a photograph taken from the shuttle, overlaid with some information about more populated areas in these sort of lighter colors, the more populated areas, and a little bit of extra information about the delta of the San Joaquin and Sacramento rivers there in the Central Valley. They added in some photos of that, but I love this image. So what you get is a significant dry area in the rain shadow, but it's really important to understand that it's not always dry. In fact, it goes back and forth. And this is the key climate detail for not just San Francisco, I'm not just the Southwest, but San Francisco as well. We have an arid climate here. And if you try to talk averages, if you try to say the average rainfall or the average moisture in the ground or that kind of thing, the averages are never going to be very close to what's happening because it swings really wildly from really wet to really dry. And the dry spells kill off a lot of the plant life that would otherwise grow, which is why this picture, which I took in 2014 in the northeastern corner of California, doesn't have any trees. Now, I have to say this dust devil really makes it dramatic, but it's so far in the northern corner of California that that's actually Nevada, that mountain behind it. And then we'll go to a wetter scene. Look how green it is in Virginia City, Nevada. Now, I just took this picture a couple weeks ago. I'm not talking about the green house. It's not moss growing on the house. It's the greenness of the hills. There's the V for Virginia City. Virginia City, by the way, just as an aside, is such an important place for the San Francisco historical concepts to understand how San Francisco became a wealthy city. Yeah, the gold rush made it a famous city, but the silver boom at the Comstock Lode in Nevada made it a wealthy city. People called it the Paris of the West, and people really were trying to imitate classier cities in Europe, even though it was a remote, difficult to get to outpost, and it was all because of the silver dug out of the hills right here in Virginia City. But the fact that it was really wet over this winter because of the atmospheric rivers that Joe mentioned and you've all noticed, that's why it's such a green hillside. The desert doesn't usually look like that. The desert is usually the brown stuff, right? This was Carson City a couple weeks ago. And it actually, there was a storm the day that I was there. This is the remnants of that storm as the sun was setting. And everything was lush and green, much greener than usual. However, any seeds or any sprouting that goes on will die off when there's a spell of dryness. So the evolutionary process leans towards things that can handle fluctuations, but especially things that don't need a lot of water. And that's going to be truer in more parts of the world as the climate becomes more extreme in every part of the world. That the lushness that you've come to associate with places like the Pacific Northwest up here, where there are lots of mountains, the whole area gets lots of rain because of those mountains and has a big rain shadow in Idaho and Eastern Oregon and so on. But that really wet area on the coast, that could very well stay wet, but it's also possible that areas of the country, other areas of the country that are very wet will become devoid of trees over the next, who knows how long, 100 or hundreds of years. Now, this is a creek that was flowing through central Nevada in a place where there shouldn't be a creek in late June. And you can see all the fresh green stuff growing. I just was so amazed when I traveled across the desert on this trip. I thought I'd share a couple of those photos. But now let's move on to the atmospheric rivers that you all come to know as jargon, maybe, and maybe you've followed them as they came in and blasted us with rain over the winter that we had so many rains. It wasn't just the winter, I guess, I don't know if you've noticed, but every single month in the past 12 months, it has rained in San Francisco, except for January, which is usually one of the rainiest months. There was no rain, no measurable rain at all in January. But things are a bit topsy-turvy, and there is usually no measurable rain for the stretch of months after March, or maybe after April, depending on the year. Those rainstorms came mostly this year in the form of atmospheric rivers. And this is a pretty crude image taken directly from satellite imagery of the Pacific Ocean showing an atmospheric river. And you can just vaguely get a sense of what that means as a river. Here's Australia way over here, and it's a huge river coming towards the coast. But there are actually other ways that make it easy to visualize this. If you've ever looked at a cup of tea or coffee or soup in the sunlight, you see these swirls of mist coming off the top. That's steam, right? That's tiny little particulate water. And it's in 3 dimensions. It's not like the surface of the Earth, which is essentially 2 dimensions. In fact, the surface of the Earth is pretty thinly covered with atmosphere, and it's only the troposphere, the bottom 10 kilometers of the atmosphere, where the weather happens. So this little stretch of the atmosphere, which is as thin as the paint on if you were to paint a sphere that's the size of a bowling ball, and that thickness of paint on the bowling ball, just a typical layer of paint on a bowling ball, is about as thick as the atmosphere proportionally that has the weather in it, the troposphere. It's very thin, almost 2-dimensional thing. And now, so to experiment a little more, because I'm obsessed with steam and these beautiful curly cues that come off of it, I thought, hey, what if I make a 2-dimensional slice of a beautiful golden beet? Nope, still 3-dimensional steam. Well, try again. So I decided to use this tool to show you a little bit about how it works in more detail. Those were pretty crude ways of explaining it, but this is a tool I absolutely adore at earth.nullschool.net, where you can get access to a very, very sophisticated modeling system that takes measurements from lots of different sources. Let's get this out of the way. And you can look at the Earth. This is our planet. This is where we live. You can rotate it with your cursor. You can zoom in and out. And the different things that you can show allow you to really visualize how things on Earth function. Right now on Earth, this is modeling and measurements, modeling based on those measurements. Here's Tropical Storm Kelvin right here, twirling in the Pacific off of Mexico. And here's a tropical depression over here in the Atlantic. The lighter colored lines are the wind lines. You can set it to show all kinds of things. If you don't want to see wind lines, you can show current lines, and it'll show the currents instead. It's a wonderful tool. I'm going to move it so that the currents coming out of the Gulf are shown. This is the current that keeps all of Northern Europe warm. Northern Europe has this unusually far north livable habitat because of the Gulf Stream. That's this current right here. And you can really get a good look at how that functions. Even in a fair amount of detail, here's Chesapeake Bay, and you can see that right around Chesapeake Bay, the Gulf Stream moves away from the coast. So lots of cool things there. But what I've got showing right now, the light blue, that is the moisture. That's what's called total precipitable water, which is what atmospheric rivers are made of. It's literally water flowing through the atmosphere. But how does it flow? Why does it flow in a line? It's the same as those swirls off of the teacup. You see these swirls here and here and here, and you can see them here and up here. All of these swirls are atmospheric rivers that are flowing away from the central band, the tropical band around the middle of the Earth near the equator, where it's hot enough to evaporate most of the water. You might think that the oceans and lakes around the world are evaporating lots of water, and they are, but by far the largest portion of the water that's evaporated off the surface of the earth is right around the equator in this band that you see as the aquamarine blue. And from there, it wafts in these swirls that we've seen in the steam. Same concept. Now, I'm going to change this from now to, I'm going to change it to wintertime. Let's go back to February. Okay, so here we go. It's going to update. There's February. So you see how dry it is in the northern hemisphere. The brown is very little precipitable water. These blue sloshes up from the equator are the atmospheric rivers. And with this, you can actually use these animation tools to go forward. It goes forward an hour at a time, and you can watch the rivers move slightly. I mean, they're atmospheric rivers, which I'll explain a little more in a moment, but this gives you the real good visual image. And if you do it this way, by clicking the double arrow, you can move, I think it's 4 hours at a time. And so you can actually do what is essentially an animation of the atmospheric rivers as they slam into, here's the Alaska and British Columbia coast. Let's zoom in a bit. Here's an atmospheric river coming and hitting the Aleutian Islands. If we go forward a little bit, we can watch this atmospheric river kind of hit the whole coast at once, and it peters out. It's not as blue here, so it's not as strong. It's not going to be able to drop as much rain, but this big one is just coming along, and this is February 16th of this year. So as we animate it and watch it, it does these swirling things that breaks apart, and big sloshes of it come against the coast, and other sloshes of it will follow. This gives you a pretty good idea of what happens as the river hits us. It could come right at us like a fire hose, or it could sweep past the way these are sweeping past as I animate it, and it will cover the whole coast with these downpours wherever the atmospheric river hits mountains, and the mountains cause the precipitation of much of that water. Now, the amount of water in something like this might be anywhere from 10, if you just take a cross section of it right here, the water flowing northward from the equator there in the atmosphere at a few hundred feet to a few thousand feet off the ground, and maybe 100 or 200 miles wide, the amount of water flowing there is very similar to the amount of water in all of the rivers of the United States combined. So a significant amount of water. And I don't mean the water that, well, let's just put it this way. The fun thing about getting together with other people interested in this stuff is we get to count 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3. I mean, it's a good ongoing joke for how many Mississippi's worth of water are in the atmospheric river that's about to hit us. And I'm going to animate it a little bit longer so that you can see what happened here on the 20th of January. There it's hitting Vancouver Island. Now it's hitting Washington, and then Oregon, and then San Francisco area. And then this next one is coming up. Now, as you can see, the common pattern, and this year was no different, the atmospheric rivers sweep down the coast usually, and they are usually much bigger when they're up north. So that's another reason that we have so many extremely lush areas in Alaska, along the Alaska coast, and all the way down to the Northern California coast, just north of San Francisco. Okay, now I will, just because it is fun to show it, I'll show you a couple more things that you can do with this, because I'm sure you're going to want to go to earth.nullschool.net and play with this when you get the chance. You can look at different versions of the map. This is the map that shows the globe, and you can look at any part of the globe. This is the projection that shows a little bit less distortion, but the overall is kind of screwed up. That most of the distortion is in the south. If you do it this way, there's all kinds of different versions. You can even use Buckminster Fuller's version that has no north, but it does the least distortion, and it folds into not a sphere, but it folds into an 8-sided figure, an octahedron, and it works pretty well. You can even mess with it like this. And by the way, this green dot is, you click there if you want to know the details of that location based on these settings that you have here. You'll have fun exploring this, I'm sure. Okay, now on to an animation that was created specifically to show how atmospheric rivers in January were hitting north of San Francisco. This is created by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And you can see the atmospheric rivers here, often coming from the tropics near Hawaii before they hit Northern California and the Alaskan coast, British Columbia, etc. But we no longer call them Pineapple Expresses because we now use the term atmospheric river, but you do find occasionally that it's useful and nice poetically to call them Pineapple Expresses the way they've been called for 100 years or so. And this is why, of course, they come from over there where the pineapples come. Now let's get to some local details of history. A lot of people are aware that San Francisco in the early days, because people read a lot about the gold rush, right? So in the early days, when the city really hadn't been built up much and hardly existed at all, there were lots of complaints about how muddy the streets were. So yeah, that's a good expression for it. So people drew these cartoons of people pulling people out of the mud and so forth. This is supposedly Montgomery Street. Of course, it's a little bit exaggerated, but this is an 1849 drawing. And here's an 1851 drawing that shows people stuck in the mud in San Francisco. And there's all kinds of funny things in this drawing. There's the Astor House, which is a play on the Waldorf Astoria and the famous Astor House in New York City, because of course people were setting up flop houses and rooming houses in San Francisco that had pretense, let's just say. So these are the kinds of things that were drawn, and it is interesting to note that we don't have this kind of stuff happen here these days very often at all. A few years, people point to 1955 as a big year for rain, 1997. And of course, this past winter was huge for rain. But the first 15 years of San Francisco as an urbanized area, that is starting in 1849, going to 1863, that 15-year period was by far the wettest period of San Francisco history. And after that, it really started to calm down. There has been a whole lot less in the way of rain. But it was after that period that the Weather Service, the National Weather Service, was created. So we don't have data that match our system of measuring now to compare with today's. Here's another thing that shows how wet it was in the early days. A lot of you have probably been to Sacramento and know that they have a sub-level of Sacramento. That was the level it used to be, but when it flooded in the early days, they raised it up, and now the basements of the buildings are what used to be street level. Well, this is a flood mazurka that was written, music specifically written to commemorate how wet it was. And a lot of people in Sacramento know about this story of how the new governor, his name was Leland Stanford, had to go to his own inauguration by boat because it was flooding in the streets of Sacramento. Well, that turns out that was a much, much bigger series of extreme weather events in a much wider area than just Sacramento. And I'll get into that in a moment, but I love the way they commemorated this, respectfully dedicated to the Sacramento Howard Benevolent Society. That's because so many people were needing their help after these big storms that flooded the streets. Now let's take a look at the Steep City map. This is the map that I created and put it on posters and shower curtains and any other thing you could care to have it printed on. And I would even actually, Hillary and I were talking on Tuesday because she and I know each other for quite a while now from the Awesome Foundation, the San Francisco chapter of the Awesome Foundation, which, by the way, is very awesome, but it is not a real foundation. It's a wonderful thing that she and I have been involved with for a long time, and we were talking about how fun it would be to do a mosaic version, because we were looking at some mosaics that we might give funding toward. And if any of you have any ideas for places to put a giant mosaic, maybe even a contoured mosaic that could, when it rains, actually have the flows of the water, that would be kind of fun. And there's also the thing that Gray Brecken has been trying for a long time. Gray Brecken at UC Berkeley has been trying for a long time to find a home for, which is a 40-something by 40-something foot model of what San Francisco was like during the 1930s. It was a New Deal project, and pieces of the model were shown in different libraries recently, but the whole model together hasn't been shown very much, and doesn't have a permanent home. So let's put our heads together and figure out a home for that. And it would be a goofy aside to put a tile mosaic of San Francisco's water underneath it on the floor. But let's take a look at this. So all of this is fill that is brown. That's bay area filled in. That's what used to be bay water and is filled in to create, you see the street grid here. The marshes, the salt marshes were filled in, and all of these dark blue lines were filled in as well. The thing that is relevant here to the climate history is, when I made this map, I did research based on the earliest records I could find, and they were almost all from the wettest period of San Francisco. So that means that all of these creeks you see were being fed by major springs, because the hills were saturated, fully saturated. And some of that 15 years of rain would have taken 10 years, 20 years. In fact, even some of it would have taken a generation or two to leak out in the form of springs. And so all of these creeks you see would have been much more significant flows in the early days of San Francisco than they could ever possibly be now. Here is a creek that comes out of Glen Park. This is an 1881 photo. This is 18 years after the last major wet winter in 1862. And yet, look how deep this creek is. This creek today is barely an inch deep when it's a major creek, when we now get excited about the water flowing out of Glen Canyon in the Glen Park neighborhood. Check it out for scale. There's the guy fishing. Actually, there's another guy fishing off the fence over here. So this photo was taken in what is now covered with houses just west of the Glen Park BART station. And this gives you an idea of how much water there was during that period, even well after the major storms. But the most major storm of that time was the 1861-62 winter. There were lots of other major storms in prehistory. And what I'm showing you here is like tree rings, but it's actually made of dirt. These are called varves, V-A-R-V-E, and varves are the annual layering of different types of sediment as it washes into the lake bottoms. If there's a lake that doesn't have an exit creek or river, it's especially good for looking at the varves because it's not as disturbed, but pretty much any lake will have sediments accumulating on the bottom in these layers, where you can actually, if you find an object down in there, you can get it to almost within a year, well, within 5 years in many of these lakes, even if it's 500 years ago that the thing got buried under the layers. It's a very accurate way of measuring when the major storms came, because they're thicker layers. And the research that was done about 20 years ago shows that there were these major storms in the Santa Barbara Basin, Southern California, approximately 212 AD, 440, 603, 1029. These are major storms. And if you look at the peaks of the actual data from different parts of the world, you can start to get a sense for how broad these storms weren't. That is to say, many of these storms were huge storms, but only happened in the Santa Barbara Basin. Some of them happened all over Southern California. Some of them happened all over the West. The one in 1862 wasn't as huge as a couple of these that are on this chart, but it was way more widespread than any other storm ever measured. And it was certainly the most extreme storm known. I stumbled across this storm. It wasn't really a storm. We're talking about a series of storms. And almost all of them were probably atmospheric rivers. About a third to a half of the water over any stretch of many decades is atmospheric river water that hits California. There's other forms of storm too, but a third to a half of it in the long run is atmospheric rivers. So I stumbled across this because I was walking across this covered bridge, Knights Ferry, and I saw this plaque built in 1864 to replace the original bridge washed away by the flood of 1862. Well, okay, interesting, but no special note. But then I noticed it in other places too. Other places had plaques about things washed away in 1862. And I started to put two and two together. Here's San Francisco in 1857. This is a map made by the Coast Survey, which was the predecessor to the US Geological Survey. And here are the buildings of downtown San Francisco and the street grid being laid out. And way out here in the boonies is Mission Dolores, right there. And just here is a hill. The contour lines concentrically here, they show a big hill. And that hill has the orphan asylum on the saddle between it and the next hill. Now, these two hills sort of still exist. This one's been chopped down mostly, and the US Mint is on it today, the one built in 1937 at Cannon and Market. And this hill is Alamo Square Park. And the orphan asylum was on the saddle between the two. At the corner of Haight and Buchanan, right there, you can see the orphan asylum. So it's kind of interesting how they put the orphan asylums way outside of town. They were actually kind of ashamed of them because most of the people in the orphan asylum were the bays from the brothels. So, and just as a fun little aside, Haight Street was actually named for one of the presidents. Weltha Haight was her name, one of the presidents of the orphan asylum, or their society that helped to run the orphan asylum. And Waller was named after Elizabeth Waller. So don't think that Haight Street was named after Governor Haight or any of the other men that have been named Haight. It was Weltha Haight whose Haight Street was named after, and Angus McFarlane, who's from this neighborhood. I live in this neighborhood right about here. And Angus did the research about who Haight Street is named after. So here you see a small cluster of buildings, but almost no buildings out here in the boonies in 1857. And very little had changed by 1862 as far as buildings, because there was no water supply. The drinking water didn't come there until 1862. So from 1857 to 1862, it was very rural. And here's an actual photograph of my neighborhood looking northwest from the hilltop that now has the Mint on it. This is Buena Vista Hill. Over on the right-hand side is the this is the street that's now Waller Street. This is the street that's now Church Street. And it comes to a T. Actually, no, this is Herman Street. Waller Street is right next to it over here. And this is Haight Street, where this low dune existed that's covered with some scrub and chaparral. And that was all flattened. Those dunes here in this area were flattened. So let's zoom in a bit. It's a very high quality photo because it was on a 22-inch negative. Oh, we gotta reset the waiting room thing, I think. So this is Alamo Square Hill up here, and this is the gap in the dune that people walked through to get from the mission to the Presidio, and the Native Americans who lived in this area walked through it for thousands of years to get from their winter village or settlement sites to their summer settlement sites. But that is the gap through which the 1862 floods came roaring through. Found out about this part of the floods when I was poking around in newspapers from 1862. And this photo actually is a photo of what isn't there. For years and years, until I did this research, people thought this was a photo of Lone Mountain, which is where USF is based right now, on top of this mountain over just north of the Panhandle. But actually, this photo was taken of what was not there. And I'll show you more details about how I figured that out. But let's see, how do we get this to move along? So in 1862, there was a flood that washed away this mill. This was in Knights Ferry as well, and lots of other places I had these clues about 1862 from different newspaper articles, but hardly anybody had ever heard of it. In fact, in all of these books that I went through, there wasn't a single mention of 1862. Even Harold Gilliam, the person who founded the journalistic form that we now take for granted of environmental journalism, and it's a common form of journalism, he was the one who first started writing journalistic columns about the environment, and he published many, many books. When I called him and asked him, he had never heard of these storms of 1862. So I spent a long time helping people to understand that the winter of 1861-62, though it was before the Weather Service, was an extreme weather event worthy of note. And one of the things that helped me to figure out that the timing of this photo, even though nobody had known the date previously, it was 1860s is all we knew, was that my video on just sharing my screen is good enough. So this is the section of Carlton Watkins' photo that really has a lot of detail. And you can see the peaks where the floodwaters deposited sand and it still hasn't dried. And you can see the individual footprints in the sand as the first people went across the sand, and the individual wagon wheel prints or carriage wheel prints in the sand. So that's how I determined that this photo was actually taken within days or even maybe hours of the flood that came gushing through here. There's even somebody's laundry hanging out here at what is now the corner of Fillmore and Haight Street. And this flood was the most dramatic aspect of the 1862 storms in San Francisco because it washed away Francois Louis Albert Pioche's home. He was one of the richest people in the city. He's well known today for various reasons, but he was a philanthropist. He was extremely well known. He owned parts of the Market Street Railway, parts of the water company, parts of lots of important things. And his home was a rented home out in the country. He was here. He had other homes that he owned and was washed away. You can look closely and see the sharp edges of a gully where the sand hasn't eroded into a smooth angle, and pieces of the fence are falling here and here. So this, on the night of the 14th of March, 1862, was where the floodwaters came gushing from a lake that had formed in the dunes here and washed away his house, undercut the sand and dumped his house into the flood and washed it down to the area near what's now Rainbow Grocery. So that was a discovery that I'm going to write quite a bit about and publish about, because nobody else has ever been able to figure out what's going on with this photo, and I have happily figured it out. This is a map of where Pioche's house was and how the flood went through the dunes and the hills. This lake that the newspapers called Phelps's Lake because Senator Abner Phelps lived right next to it in one of the few houses in the neighborhood. This 25-acre lake was carefully described over the few days before the breached sand dam. And the sand was probably piled up here by some people who were hired by Pioche because he didn't want his house to get flooded. Well, it did break through, and that's the flood. This pink is the flood water coming through. And here is an 1868 bird's eye view of the city, and it even includes right through Piocha's house a commemoration of the floodwaters sloshing across Market Street here in what was no longer a creek bed, hadn't been a creek bed since the 1870s. I'm sorry, the 1770s, when it was diverted into the farm fields of the mission. Then in Sacramento, there were actually some photographs. Do you recognize this image? This is actually the same exact image as the photo from which this image was taken. This is the flood mazurka lithograph, but since the printing process couldn't print photographs at the time, they would hand make a lithograph from the photo. Notice here's a guy pushing a little raft with a stick in the photo that he or she, oops, there we go. In the photo that the artist went from, the stick is on the other side, and there are more people added into the lithograph than are in the photo, because actually lots of photos exist from that flood. So this photo was taken not only on the day of Stanford's inauguration, but in the location that he was passing in his boat. So that very well could have been Stanford being rowed to the California Supreme Court building, which is now marked as the place in Sacramento where the Pony Express ended. That could have been very well him going by when the photo was taken. Here's another photo of Sacramento, but in fact, the entire region, all the way from Canada down to Mexico and inland to the Colorado River Basin, the Virgin River, all the Columbia River, had these crazy storms from the November 1861 to March 1862 stretch of time. And they were so severe that they washed away almost every single bridge in the entire Western United States. I've only been able to find 3 bridges that existed through those storms. One of the bridges that washed away in Folsom was 55 feet off the water in normal times. So it was a very extreme weather event, or series of extreme weather events. Now this that you see now is actually a tree that was blown over. I took this photo a month and a half ago in Calaveras County at Calaveras Big Trees State Park. And this is a tree that was blown over during those storms. It's a giant sequoia. There's a person walking the path that actually cuts right through. There's a child and there's an adult. The path cuts right through the tree trunk, right in there between the roots and the main part of the trunk. And I'm standing on the trunk about 150 feet, what would have been above the roots, but nowhere near the top of the tree when I took this photo. So that's the only direct physical object I know of where the damage, you can actually go and see the damage from the wind. Wind is a really important thing to keep track of. I'm going to wind down now, and I'm pretty much done, and I'm ready for questions. But I do want to say that as people talk about climate change and the climate extremes, keep in mind that sea level rise, floods, and storms, and fires, and droughts are getting a lot of attention. But wind is one of the most extreme aspects because it can actually topple buildings and trees and land on people and cause the Golden Gate Bridge to sing. The Golden Gate Bridge has actually had its railings replaced recently because the Golden Gate Bridge District decided that there was too much surface area on the balustrades catching the wind as the wind gets stronger and stronger. So they replaced them with slats. And it turns out that they act as reeds. And so the bridge makes a sound when the wind is the right strength and at the right angle, which happens quite often. That's the reason it's happening, and the wind is something to keep an eye on. All righty then. I'm ready for questions, and that's the end. Can we do a question thing?
Okay, if people want to ask a question, please unmute yourself or raise your hand. or you can't raise your hand because I can't see you, but yeah, you can raise your hand, your virtual hand, or you can put your question or your wish to ask a question in the chat. And you can put on your video if you want to. The meeting's locked now, and that
if
means
we-
nobody
if we-
else can come in.
If we put on our video, are we running the risk of getting back into the territory we were in a few minutes ago?
No, because the meeting's locked now, so nobody else can come
I
in.
see. Okay, okay.
Well, let me, this is Joe, just start off with a question. So what do you make now of what happened last year? We've seen that there have been years and 150, 200 years ago that were as bad or worse. Is there any pattern you see? Do you think there's a chance we could be seeing these atmospheric rivers? We could have, this could be the first of 15 atmospheric river years of this size. What do you think, Joel?
Well, you ask, is there any chance? And the answer is definitely yes. There's a chance because it has happened in the past. The winter that we just had was small compared to 1862. And 1862 was small compared to some of the ones that were logged by the VARV measurements at the sediment levels in the bottoms of the lakes. Over the last 2,000 years, 5 of them were larger than 1862. And although those were regional, the amount of water that comes out of the sky and the extent of it, combined with the wind, could easily surpass by a factor of 20 or 50 or even 100. And I don't mean this to be alarmist, I'm just giving you the scientific data. The amount of extreme weather we had this past winter was small compared to what happened in 1862 and those other years. So yes, very easily that could happen, and it could happen anytime. It could happen any winter, especially in the winter, but the weather systems are changing enough so that extreme weather can happen quite unexpectedly any time of year.
Donna had a question.
I wanted to throw in, I
Oh.
talked to a guy in his 90s who was the director of the state flood control in the 50s. And I asked him, why had so few people heard about these 1862? Even people who study weather, like Harold Gilliam, had never heard about these great storms. And he said, well, think about who would have been responsible for making sure the public knows about them. He said, I would have been, or people like me, the flood control folks, would have been responsible for that. But we didn't want to tell you because there's no way that there would ever be enough money in the budget to protect you against them. And you would have blamed us if we told you they existed, but we couldn't protect you against them. You would have blamed us for not protecting you anyway. So we just kept it quiet. Well, it's not quiet anymore. A lot of people have been talking about it. And in fact, the state did do some projects, one called ArcStorm, where they tried to model what it would be like today and how many, literally millions of people would have their houses underwater in something like the 1862 storm. And the meteorologists said, no, we're not going to go along with this because it's way more extreme than anything we've ever seen, and we don't believe it because the data that was collected at that time was only newspaper stories and that kind of thing. There was no weather service to collect good scientific satellite or any other kind of data. So basically, they watered it down, so to speak, and did the ArcStorm modeling based on about 1/6 the size of the storms of 1862. People get pretty freaked out when they hear about how bad it can be and that there's no way to protect against it.
Donna had a question.
Yeah, so it's very frustrating to me that I can no longer find these books, but my husband and I, maybe 20, 25 years ago, had 2 books about really extreme years, one of which was 1862, and it was a nonfiction book with a lot of detail. I can't remember the author, and it was a one-word title. It was either flood or water or something like that. And then there was another one for like 1910 when with fire, when the whole pattern of fire suppression started because there were so many fires all over the West. Do you know does this book about the flood or the water I'd love to reread it because it was riveting, absolutely riveting. And I'd love to turn other people onto it. Do you does this ring a bell to you?
I appreciate that. I don't know of a book that was written. Well, do you have any idea when it was published, or when did you see it?
Well, we read it in the 80s or 90s.
Oh, really?
And it possibly even earlier than that, but I think it was the 80s or the 90s. And it had been written, kind of early in the 20th century, maybe in the 30s, 40s, 50s, something like that.
I've looked and I've never found a book like that. I've looked hard, but there are books that mention it, usually in a few sentences. They say,
oh no, this was
particular
really,
winter.
this was, 300 or 400 pages.
Wow.
And it even continued up into what happened in the mountains, the implications, because it's where it rained down here, it snowed up there.
Well,
And there were
Donna,
details of people that got stuck on trains, and it's a wonderful book, and it has one word title.
I definitely need to sleuth this with you at some point in the future. We should track each other down and do that, because I want to know about that book too.
Okay.
There was a novel called Storm. That was the novel from which the naming of storms came, but I don't think that's what you're talking about.
I don't think so. That could have been the title of this book, but I don't think it was, and I don't think it had anything to do with the naming of storms.
Okay, well, no, it did. The novel didn't, but the tradition of naming storms grew out of that novel. In any case, it's vaguely possible, I suppose, that could be what you're thinking of, but I can't think of any other candidates.
I don't think so, because I don't think it was a novel, but of course I'm 80 years old and my memory is not terrific. So it's possible that I'm remembering it as nonfiction and it was a novel.
Let's try to find it.
I can offer Donna, if you two don't have your each other's email address, Donna, you can send me an email and I will forward it to Joel's if I have.
Okay.
Joel, you in agreement with that?
That's great. And actually, anybody can reach me through seepcity.org or thinkwalks.org. My email address is right on there.
Okay. We have any other questions? I'm going to ask one while you all think of any more. We haven't talked about reservoirs. They're all pretty full right now. I see Bureau of Reclamation. Yes, that's the Central Valley related series of reservoirs. That's 80–90% full. East Bay is even higher than that. So San Francisco, what's going to happen if we have another atmospheric river hit us next year to this extent?
That's an interesting and tricky topic, because the people who run those reservoirs have different purposes. Each reservoir has a different purpose and a different combination of purposes. Some of them have what's called 40% flood control purpose, which is, I think, the maximum. I don't think there are any that are 100% for flood control, but but providing water to cities and to ranches and to electric generation and various things can be the purpose of many of these dams and reservoirs. But there are many of them that they cannot keep them 100% full because they're flood control. So they keep them 40% empty specifically as flood control. However, they don't have to keep them that way long term. They can try to anticipate if a storm is coming, they lower them to 40% by raising the river levels for a while. So it's a very tricky thing to decide how much. And as you probably recall, a couple of years ago, the dam at Oroville, which is the highest dam in California and was the highest dam in the world when it was built in the 60s, I guess, that almost got destroyed by a miscalculation of that sort, where it rained a lot more than was expected in a shorter time than expected, and it overtopped the dam. And everybody had, well, 180,000 people had to evacuate from towns right below the dam. So yeah, it could easily happen with a miscalculation. And the dams, many of the dams haven't been really seriously maintained in the way that they should have been. So a lot of catch up is being done in the Oroville Dam, was seriously upgraded in the 2 years since. I guess I don't know if I even actually answered your question, but basically I think I gave an overview. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think you did.
Okay.
But we could be, what I took away from that is we have some control over if we have another 2 or 3 or 15 years like we had this past year. But there could be some serious damage. We're not totally prepared.
Right, that's what the flood control guy from the 50s was talking about, that the amount of money it takes to actually do flood prevention. And we have so many dams now. There are very few rivers that are not dammed in California, but that we have enough dams that it can actually do a pretty good job of flood control, except in ... lots of specific situations that almost never happen.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions? It looks like Sarah, you had a question? You may be muted, Sarah. But her question is, what do you see in the next 50 years? Or Sarah, you can ask your question.
Yeah, no, I was just curious, Joel, this has been fascinating. I love the pictures of the changes in the coast, and that's really good for us to see. It will be imprinted on our minds. But especially, what do you see in the next, say, 50 years, should we live that long?
Hang on. I'm gonna go get my crystal ball. Hang on.
Okay, thank you. we
It's
we were
out in the
hoping you
hall.
had one.
Sorry, no, it's out in the hall, but it's not that useful because it has bubbles in it, so it's not that easy to see the future. But this is what happens when I talk about this, and this is why I actually focused most of my work on the water history of San Francisco, streams and springs and shoreline. After I initially thought I would write a book about these extreme weather events, because when I talk about this stuff, inevitably people want me to predict the future. And I did not want to be that guy who was always being called in to tell how much damage there's going to be, how much we should be afraid, and so on. I think that one of the main reasons to be a researcher, or to be curious, or to be a part of nature, is to realize the systems that we're a part of are actually big systems, and we are not in control of them, no matter what we're told, and no matter how much we have been lulled into thinking that we've tamed nature since the Industrial Revolution. We really have to acknowledge and plan for being out of control sometimes. I can't do better than that. I mean, the future is as much an unknown to me as anyone else, but I do think that it's worth noting that all the predictions that the IPCC have made, each time they update, it's worse than the extreme weather is looking worse than the most extreme prediction that they had previously made. So it's a time. We're going to have a time. It's going to
Yes,
be.
well, thank you. I agree with you 100%. I know last time when Ben Santer was speaking to us too, he remains optimistic within the degree that we can control what's going on. And we all do our little part and then keep learning.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize that doing our little part makes us feel good, but what we really need to do is we need to stop the fossil fuel companies from putting profit before everything else. And that is an extremely difficult task in a world where the most powerful country is essentially controlled by big corporations. So we've got a big task ahead of us, but I don't think that you should feel guilty if you do a little bit of this or a little bit of that you know isn't good for the environment. The big thing is to keep your energy for pushing hard against the political policies that keep the fossil fuels in use. And that's the best that you can do. It's really less than a drop in a bucket to worry about most things about your personal life. Of course, it is important in lots of ways to reduce the meats in your life and the transportation use of fossil fuels for your life, but that's mostly about inspiring and building community and so forth. It's not so much about saving the earth at this point. and the ecosystems are very out of balance. So I don't think it's extreme to use phrases like saving the earth as we know it, at least.
Mhm. Thank you.
Audrey, can you unmute yourself? You're unmuted. Well, I thought you were unmuted. Nope, you're still muted. I think you can hold down the space bar on your keyboard while you're talking, and that temporarily unmutes you.
Okay, I got it.
Good.
Okay, you're talking about floods mostly, but we're getting floods, and we're also getting intermittent, very hot spells and droughts. So can any of those things be predicted, soon enough for us to evacuate or whatever we have to do to take?
It's hard to know what we have to do because the evacuations have to be related to where it's most likely to catch fire, I suppose, in a drought, and where it's most likely to flood in a storm. But things change very suddenly, and there are quite a few people, especially at the state level, who are trying to keep that going. The California version of FEMA is very focused on getting information out when necessary for those kinds of things. But it doesn't help that the Central Valley has so much new construction in it. During the 1862 floods, the Central Valley was almost like a bathtub. I mean, the guy who was sent around the state, George Whitney, to take a reading on all the natural resources in the state, happened to be doing so during those storms. And he said there was a 300-mile by 20-mile lake in the Central Valley during those storms.
Wow.
So there are lots of people who live in that zone now, and evacuating might be a last-minute thing. We don't know how it'll all work out, but this is what is meant. This might round out the picture a little for you about the abstract things, or I shouldn't say round out, sharpen the picture about the abstract things that you hear being talked about, where they say the extremes will be more extreme and the amount of refugee movement will go up exponentially.
Wow.
Alan?
Thank
Yes.
you.
Thanks. Is there any relationship between phases of the sun, like we're getting near a maximum now, and the kind of patterns you're talking about, the unusual disrupted weather?
There are relationships like that, but they are tiny compared to the effects that anthropogenic greenhouse gases are creating. And that can be easily shown by the fact that there are different kinds of carbon, and you can look at the kinds of carbon that are in the air, and the signature of that kind of carbon is industrial carbon. So we can follow the pattern separate from the patterns of solar maxima and minima. And it is unfortunately a very small contribution, meaning to say, in comparison, it's been dwarfed by the fossil fuel use aspect.
I'm going to ask one last question, Joel, if I can. The Coriolis effect. I'm thinking back on your talk. It is caused by the rotation of the Earth. That's what powers it. Is that right?
Well, it's not that it powers it in the usual sense of the word powering. It's kind of that since the Earth is rotating, anything moving on the surface of the Earth gets the Earth rotated out from underneath it, wherever it tries to go. So relative to the Earth's surface, it appears that the Earth, instead of rotating out from underneath it, it appears that the thing that's moving is veering on the surface of the Earth.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I just needed to hear that twice.
Okay, good.
Any other questions? It's getting close to 4:30, so if not,
I do want to say that if
yes,
people
please.
think of questions later, you're welcome to get in touch with me through my phone or email address that are on seepcity.org.
Okay. with that, Joel, it's been really interesting. Thank you for the whole presentation. We applaud you. Really interesting and a
Thank you.
perfect complement to last month's presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again. And we'll see you all in a month for the next meeting.